There is a kind of silence that only exists in small towns, not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of everyone knowing everyone else's business and choosing very carefully what to say out loud and what to keep folded behind their eyes. Pine Ridge, Wyoming had that silence in abundance. It lived in the space between neighbors waving from driveways without stopping to talk. It lived in the way the diner regulars could sit at the same tables for 20 years and still manage to avoid the one conversation that actually needed to happen. 4,000 people, one main street, 3 traffic lights, and a coffee shop on the corner of Main and Fifth that had been there longer than most of the town could remember. Mabel's Diner didn't try to be anything it wasn't. The chairs were wood and worn smooth from decades of use. The tables had coffee rings baked into them that no amount of wiping would ever fully erase. The chalkboard menu on the back wall had handwriting so faded you almost had to know what you wanted before you walked in. The coffee was strong and cheap and came in mugs that felt like they had weight and history. There was no seasonal menu. There was no Wi-Fi password posted anywhere. There was no aesthetic. There was just Mabel's. And for the people of Pine Ridge, that was more than enough. On Thursday mornings, the diner filled in layers. The construction workers came first before 7 steel-toed boots on the linoleum voices, still rough with sleep, ordering eggs and not saying much. Then the retirees settling into their corners like birds returning to the same branches. Then the late risers, the ones with office jobs and flexible hours. By 9 o'clock, the room had its own ecosystem, everyone in their place, everyone more or less accounted for. Ruth Calloway arrived at 8:15. She always arrived at 8:15 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, had for 17 years. Meanwhile, the walk from her house on Birch Street took 11 minutes in good weather, 14 when her left hip was acting up, which it did more often now that she was past 70. She never drove anymore. Dale had driven. After Dale, she'd sold the truck and started walking everywhere she needed to go, which wasn't far, and that was fine. She was 74 years old, 5'3" in the good shoes. Brown coat the color of autumn leaves going dull-worn soft at both elbows from years of resting her arms on table edges. Leather bag old and dark, the clasp replaced once when it broke. Reading glasses on a thin silver chain around her neck. Hair gone fully white, now pinned back in a way that was practical rather than styled. She walked with a cane on days the hip was bad, and this was one of those days. She looked to anyone who didn't know better, like a woman with nowhere particular to be and nothing particularly urgent on her mind. But this morning, Ruth Calloway did not sit at her usual table. Her usual table was in the corner by the east window. 4 steps from the door, clear sightline to the street, morning sun hitting at just the right angle to make reading comfortable without a glare. She had sat at that table so many times the chair legs had small scuff marks on the floor exactly where she pulled it out. It was in every meaningful sense her table. Everyone in Mabel's knew it. This morning she walked past it. She went to the counter instead. The long bar with the spinning stools running the length of the back wall. She chose the seat at the far right end, the one with the fullest view of the room, the one where your back was to the wall and you could see both the front door and the side entrance at once. She sat down. She settled her bag on the stool beside her. She placed her cane against the counter, and then she looked at her watch. Danny Reeves, 22 years old, 2 years into her job at Mabel's, and already moving through the morning rush with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to read the room before speaking, appeared without being called. "Morning, Miss Ruth." The usual, "Please, sweetheart." "Corner table's open." Ruth looked at the corner table, then back at Danny. She smiled, and it was a small smile, the kind that lives mostly in the eyes. "I know. I'll sit here today." Danny gave her a look that was not quite a question and not quite an agreement, then went to pour the coffee. She set the mug down in front of Ruth, along with the small ceramic creamer Ruth never used and a spoon Ruth always placed to the left of the mug before she began. Ruth wrapped both hands around the mug. She did not drink. She looked at the door. Outside, Pine Ridge was going about its Thursday. A pickup rolled by on Main. 2 boys on bicycles circled the parking lot of the hardware store across the street. The sky over Wyoming was that specific shade of October blue that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth, high and cold, and so clear it almost hurt to look at directly, like the atmosphere itself had been wrung out overnight and hung up to dry. Ruth opened her black notebook on the counter. She uncapped her pen. She did not write anything. She was waiting. She had been waiting in one form or another for over a year. The door opened at 9:03. Not her people. Not yet. 3 of them, and you heard them before you fully processed what you were seeing. Not because they were loud at exactly, but because they occupied space at a volume that exceeded their actual noise level. It was something in the way they moved, as if the room was expected to rearrange itself around them, rather than the other way around. Chad Merritt came in first, 34 years old. Big through the shoulders in the way of a man who used to be athletic and had since let the muscle blur slightly at the edges. Square jaw, haircut close on the sides. He wore a canvas jacket over a collared shirt and had the look of someone who had gotten dressed quickly and still managed to appear like he'd spent time on it. His business card said Deputy Regional Development Director at Merritt Real Estate Group. What that meant in practice was that his father, Bill Merritt, ran one of the largest property acquisition companies in the region, and Chad attended meetings and signed things and made calls and was generally understood to be the person you spoke to when you wanted Bill Merritt's ear, without having to get through to Bill Merritt himself. He was in the specific taxonomy of small-town American life, a man who had inherited significance without earning it, and had spent enough years having that significance reflected back at him that he'd come to believe it was native. Behind him came Tanner Cole. 31, lean, the kind of person you remembered the presence of before you remembered the face. He and Chad had been friends since high school in the way that sometimes happens between a golden boy and his most adaptable companion. Tanner agreed with whatever Chad said just at a half second before Chad finished saying it, which had made him invaluable. He was already on his phone as he came through the door, pulling up an app with the automatic ease of long habit. The small red dot of a recording indicator blinked to life as he set the phone open on the table. He recorded conversations the way other people took notes, a habit developed during real estate walkthroughs with Chad, where details mattered and memory was unreliable. He set it face up on the table and left it running. Kylie came in last 26 and pretty. In a way, she worked at already pulling out her phone as she stepped through the door, the front camera flipping on with the reflexive ease of someone who had made documentation of every room she entered a habit rather than a decision. They took the center table. Of course they took the center table. Not the best table by any practical measure. It was directly under a light fixture that hummed slightly too close to the kitchen, passed through for comfort with sightlines to nothing in particular. But it was the most visible table. It was the one a room full of people would find their eyes drifting toward, if only because it was in the middle of everything. And that for Chad Merritt was sufficient. He sat down the way men sit when they consider a room their property. Danny appeared and he ordered without looking at the menu, and he ordered loudly enough that the people at the adjacent tables could hear exactly what he wanted. The coffee came. The conversation started. And for a few minutes, Mabel's Diner on a Thursday morning simply absorbed them the way it absorbed everything, with the patient, tired tolerance of a room that had seen too much to be particularly startled by any of it. Ruth did not turn around. She sat at the counter with her untouched coffee and her open notebook, and she listened. It started with the chair. Tanner pushed it back without looking, the legs catching the floor just as Danny was walking past with a fresh pour for the counter. The mug tipped. Not much. A small slosh, maybe 2 tablespoons of coffee, spreading across the lower right corner of Ruth's open notebook page, bleeding into the ink, turning a morning's worth of careful notation into a brown-edged blur. Ruth looked down at the page. She did not move immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something when you are deciding whether to let yourself feel the full weight of it or to set that feeling aside for later. Danny started apologizing immediately, the words tumbling out fast. "It's all right, sweetheart," Ruth said quietly. "It's not your fault." Chad's voice came from behind her. "Oh, sorry about that." 2 words of apology wrapped in a tone that contained no apology whatsoever. "You okay over there?" Ruth opened the small zipper pocket on the inside of her bag and removed a folded handkerchief, white, with a small blue border pressed flat. She pressed it gently to the wet page. Methodical, unhurried. She did not answer. She did not look up. Chad waited a moment, and when nothing came back, he turned back to his table. And the thing he took from that moment, the thing Ruth understood he would take, because she knew exactly the kind of man he was that she hadn't spoken because she couldn't. Because she was the kind of person who absorbed these things and said nothing. Because she was easy. He had just told himself a story about her, and every word of it was wrong. Across the room, Frank DeLuca watched from his usual table near the back. 68 years old, retired from the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department after 25 years, big hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, the lines in his face telling the particular story of a man who had spent a career watching people make bad decisions and had developed a professional ability to recognize the early stages of a situation before it became something requiring paperwork. He looked at Chad's table. He looked at Ruth at the counter. He looked back down at his coffee. He didn't say anything. Not yet. At the table by the window, George Harmon, owner of Harmon Hardware, 2 doors down, glanced up briefly from his newspaper, then returned to it. Harriet Voss from the post office was doing something on her phone. 2 plumbers from a local outfit were eating eggs and not paying much attention to anything. Nobody did anything. The room made its small collective choice the one rooms make in these moments, the choice of the path with the least friction, and returned to its business. Ruth blotted the notebook page carefully. She turned to a fresh one. She set the pen against the paper. She did not write. She listened, because Chad Merritt was talking. He'd been talking since he sat down, but now the conversation had moved somewhere Ruth recognized. Dad's already got the votes lined up, Chad was saying, leaning back in his chair. County zoning's been a non-issue for months. The only thing left is the town council approval next week, and that's— He made a small, dismissive rotation of his wrist. Taken care of. Tanner nodded along. Kylie scrolled. The Callaway parcel was the last piece. Dad closed on that 3 years ago. He picked up his mug. That whole family, the old lady, sold it cheap as anything. No idea what she had. He said it the way people talk about finding a good deal at an estate sale. No cruelty intended specifically. Just the easy thoughtlessness of someone who had never had to think about the value of the things they owned because they had always owned enough of them. Ruth stopped not writing. Her pen was in her hand. The tip hovered above the blank page. She was aware of the specific pressure of the pen against her fingers, the specific temperature of the counter under her other hand, the specific sound of Chad Merritt's voice carrying across the room with the acoustic confidence of someone who had never once wondered who else might be listening. Her pen did not touch the page. To anyone watching, nothing about her had changed. She sat in exactly the same posture. Her expression was what it had been. But she had gone somewhere else for a moment. A different Tuesday morning. A kitchen table in a house on Birch Street. A lawyer's letter spread flat before her. The language of it formal and cold in a way that made her feel like a child reading a document in a language she almost but didn't quite speak. The phrase potential legal action appearing twice. The phrase quiet resolution offered as the alternative. Dale had been gone 2 years by then. The savings account was thin, in the way accounts get thin when you're on a fixed income, and the world keeps getting more expensive in small increments. Her lawyer, the man who had handled everything since Dale's passing, had retired to Arizona to be near his daughter. She had been 71 years old and very much alone in that kitchen, and she had signed the paper because she was afraid, and because she did not know yet that the fear had been manufactured for exactly that purpose. She knew now. She breathed once slow and complete, and she came back to the counter at Mabel's diner, and she turned the blank page of her notebook and wrote the date at the top of the new one in her careful, even hand. The second thing happened 15 minutes later. Chad had moved on in conversation, the project, the square footage, the expected return, the drainage solutions for the Valleyland. Tanner nodding at intervals, the recording app on the table capturing all of it. But the tone in the room had shifted in the way tones shift when someone realizes they have an audience and decides to play to it. This whole town, Chad said louder now, with the knowing ease of someone making a joke they expect to land, has been sitting on value it doesn't even understand for 30 years. He looked around the diner with a half smile that invited everyone present to either agree with him or reveal themselves as someone who wouldn't. People around here have been selling dirt cheap because nobody told them what they were sitting on. A few tables went quieter, not agreement, not disagreement, just the tightening that happens when a room senses the conversation moving towards something uncomfortable and hasn't decided whether to get involved. Kylie had her phone out now, camera facing the room, sweeping slowly. She moved it along the counter across the tables past the chalkboard menu, and then she stopped. She stopped it on Ruth. Ruth at the counter, notebook, open pen in hand, white hair against brown coat, the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that stillness is its own form of dignity. Hey, Kylie said it with the brightness of someone who finds something genuinely amusing. What are you writing over there? The room did not go completely quiet, but it went quieter. What's that, a diary? A letter to your family. Kylie laughed, not unkindly exactly, but in the way of someone for whom amusement is simply automatic. Are you writing your will? Tanner snorted. Chad grinned into his mug. Danny appeared from nowhere, cloth in hand, looking between Ruth and the table with the expression of someone cycling through about 6 emotions, simultaneously landing on something that was a combination of furious and helpless. Ruth looked at the phone for a moment. Then she looked at Kylie, And then with the measured deliberateness of someone who has decided to speak rather than not speak, but has also decided exactly how many words to use, "You should put that down, sweetheart." The lightness went out of Kylie's face. "Excuse me." The phone. Ruth's voice was even, not cold, not angry, the voice of someone explaining something simple. "I think you should put it away." "I don't think you get to tell me." "That's enough." Frank DeLuca was on his feet. He had his coffee mug still in one hand, which made it slightly absurd, but his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 25 years saying those words at the precise moment they needed to be said, and the room felt it. He took 3 steps toward the center table. "Chad, that's enough." Chad looked at Frank. Something moved in his eyes, recognition, then dismissal in a sequence so fast it was almost subliminal. "Frank." Warm, familiar, the voice of a man greeting a minor obstacle. "Didn't realize you were still coming in here. Good to see you." A pause exactly long enough to make the pivot feel deliberate. "But this really isn't anything to do with you. I've known Ruth Calloway for 20 years. I'm sure you have, and I'm sure she's perfectly capable of speaking for herself." He said it with the ease of someone who has never needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. "My father has a number of active projects in the county right now. Some of them involve working relationships with the town development office. I'd hate for any of that to get complicated by the small dismissive gesture again, a misunderstanding about a conversation in a diner." The room was very quiet. Frank stood with his coffee mug in his 25 years of knowing when a fight was winnable and when it wasn't, in the particular agony of a man who knew exactly what was happening and exactly what it would cost him to do something about it. He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at him. And very slightly, so slightly, that only someone watching her carefully would have caught it, she shook her head. Not a shake that meant "I give up." Not a shake that meant "You're right, stay out of it." A shake that meant "Not yet, not this way, I have it." Frank stood for another long moment. Then he went back to his table. He sat down. He stared into his coffee. And the room once again made its collective choice. Harriet looked at her phone. George found something in his newspaper. The 2 plumbers finished their eggs. The young mother near the window, who had been pretending to look at something on her own phone since the moment Kylie raised her camera, pulled her small son a fraction closer and said nothing. Danny went back behind the counter. When she straightened, she looked at Ruth with the expression of someone who wanted very badly to say something and had no idea what the right thing was. Ruth reached out and briefly touched the young woman's hand. That was all. Just that. And then Ruth did something that no one in the room expected. She closed her notebook. She capped her pen and slipped it into the inside pocket of her bag, where it lived alongside a small penknife, a folded packet of tissues, a worn leather card holder, and a specific envelope she had been carrying for the past 6 weeks ever since the date was settled. She placed both hands flat on the counter. And then she turned around on the counter stool until she was facing the room. Facing Chad's table specifically, but not only Chad's table. Facing all of it. Tanner with his phone still recording on the table, Kylie with her fingers frozen over her screen, the regulars in their corners, Frank at his table in the back, Danny behind the counter. All of it. She sat with her back straight in the particular way of a woman who had grown up when you didn't slouch in public because slouching communicated something about your character, and she looked at Chad Merritt with the full measure of her attention. And she spoke. Her voice carried. Not because she raised it, but because she had learned over the course of a long life how to put weight into words without adding volume. "You just asked who I think I am." It traveled across the diner the way sound travels when the room has gone quiet enough for it to reach every corner without effort. "I'm not going to answer that right now. That's not what today is for." She paused, choosing the next word specifically. "But I want you to notice something." She kept her eyes on Chad. "I have sat at that corner table every Tuesday and Thursday for 17 years, without exception. I know every crack in the window glass over there. I know which chair wobbles. I know where the sun hits at 8:30 in October and where it hits at 8:30 in March." She looked at the corner table for just a moment, then back. "This morning I sat here instead, at this counter, facing the door." A beat. "I ordered coffee an hour ago. I've been watching the door since before you walked in." She looked at her watch, the same small gesture she'd made when she first arrived, quiet and unremarked, that now arrived with its full meaning attached. "I've been waiting for someone," she said, "and they're almost here." Chad stared at her. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite mockery. He glanced at Tanner. He looked back at the old woman in the worn brown coat. Waiting for who? He kept the lightness in his voice, but the lightness had more effort in it now. Your book club, Ruth did not answer. She looked at the door. She looked at the door because she had heard it. Not the door opening, not yet, but the sound that preceded it building from the edge of audibility to something unmistakable, something that didn't belong to the regular acoustic vocabulary of a Thursday morning in a small Wyoming town. It came from down Main Street, from somewhere beyond the range of vision, through Mabel's front windows, and it arrived first as a low-register vibration that the chest received before the ears fully did, and then as something more specific. Engines, not one, not two, many. Harley-Davidson motors have a sound unlike anything else in American mechanical life. Automotive engineers have spent decades trying to explain it, the specific firing interval of the V-twin, the way it produces that uneven, syncopated throb that sits somewhere between a heartbeat and a drum pattern. People who have spent time around them say you feel it before you hear it, that the first thing it does is move something in the midsection before the brain has processed it as sound. Every person in Mabel's diner felt it at the same moment. Forks paused over plates. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. George lowered his newspaper. The young mother looked up from her phone. The two plumbers set down their coffee mugs simultaneously, though neither appeared to notice they'd done it together. The sound grew and grew. And then the first bike appeared in the window, and the second behind it, and then they were filling the street one after another, a procession of dark chrome and black leather, moving past the window of Mabel's diner, with the unhurried deliberateness of something that knew it did not need to hurry, that the world would wait. 12 motorcycles found their places along the curb in front of Mabel's. The sound reached a peak, and then one by one the engines cut out. The silence that followed was its own event, the specific silence of a room that has just absorbed something too large for it and is still recalibrating. The front door opened. He came in first. 6'2", maybe 6'3". Not the size of someone built for display, but the size of someone who had simply ended up this large because the rest of him had needed somewhere to go. Salt and pepper hair cut close. Beard trimmed in a way that was neater than you expected. A scar along the right side of his jaw, following the jawline old enough to have gone fully flat and pale. Eyes the color of winter sky, the kind of blue that doesn't warm easily. The vest was black leather. On the left chest, the logo of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, the Death's Head, in red and white crisp against the dark leather. Below it, a rocker that read Wyoming. On the back, the full patch. Behind him, 11 more came through the door. They filled the diner the way water fills a container, completely, and without apologizing for taking up space. They were not loud about it. They sat down, shrugged off the cold, set their gloves on table surfaces. Some talked quietly. Some simply occupied their chairs with the ease of people who had been in enough rooms to know that rooms adjust to them, not the other way around. And the man who came in first walked through all of it without looking left or right, past the silent tables, past Frank DeLuca sitting up straighter than he had all morning, past Chad Merritt, who had gone very still in the center of the room, all the way to the counter, to the end stool on the far right, to the old woman in the worn brown coat who had been sitting there for an hour waiting. He stopped, and on the face of Tommy Malone, chapter president of the Hells Angels Wyoming, appeared something that no one in that room could have predicted, and very few of them would have known how to name. Warmth. Simple, genuine, uncomplicated warmth. Miss Ruth? Tommy. She looked up at him. You made good time. You called at 6 in the morning. He pulled out the stool next to her and sat down, and there was something in the way he moved in proximity to her, careful, unhurried, a fraction more gentle than the rest of him suggested, was his default that spoke of a long history in a specific kind of regard. When you call at 6 in the morning, I drive fast. Your mother raised you right. You and her both know she didn't. He folded his hands on the counter, looked at her. What happened? Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her bag, where the envelope had been waiting since she left Birch Street this morning. I brought the papers, she said. Then let's start there. And behind her, in the center of the room, Chad Merritt had not moved. He was staring at the back of Ruth's coat, at the envelope, at the man beside her. His coffee had gone cold, but he hadn't noticed. The silence that followed Tommy Malone sitting down at that counter was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded it. The first silence, the one that fell when the engines cut out and the door came open, had been the silence of surprise, of a room receiving information it hadn't asked for. That kind of silence is unstable. It lasts 10, maybe 15 seconds before the brain catches up and the room starts making sense of what it's seeing. This silence was different. This was the silence of understanding. It settled into Mabel's diner the way cold air settles into a room when a window has been opened slowly, completely, finding every corner. It was the silence of George Harmon's newspaper staying face down on the table forgotten. It was the silence of the two plumbers sitting with full coffee mugs that neither of them reached for. It was the silence of Kylie's phone face down and Tanner's eyes fixed on a spot somewhere between the salt shaker and the wall, and Danny standing behind the counter with a coffee pot in one hand and no intention of moving. Chad Merritt had not sat back down. He had stood up when Tommy came in, not intentionally, not as any kind of gesture, but because the arrival of 12 Hells Angels into a room where he had been the largest presence produced in his body an instinctive recalibration that his legs enacted before his brain issued any instruction. He stood beside his table with his hand resting on the back of his chair and his face arranged in an expression he intended to read as composed, and that read to anyone experienced in watching people maintain composure under pressure as precisely the opposite. He looked at Tommy's back, at the vest, at the 11 other men arranged across his field of vision with the unhurried ease of people who were exactly where they had intended to be. He pushed back from the table and walked toward the counter. Tommy did not turn around. He heard the footsteps. Of course, he heard them, a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades in rooms where you learned to hear footsteps. But he kept his eyes on Ruth and waited. Chad stopped 2 feet behind him. "I don't know where you all are coming from," he said. He kept his voice level, friendly, almost the voice of a man accustomed to entering confrontations as the one setting the terms. "But this is a private conversation. Whatever she's told you, this is a business matter. It doesn't—" "Sit down." 2 words. Tommy said them to the counter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't turn around. He simply said the 2 words in the tone of a man who had issued instructions in serious situations for a very long time and had long since stopped needing to perform the authority behind them. The room went to a new level of quiet. Chad stood where he was. He was 34 years old, and he had never in his adult life had someone speak to him that way in a room full of people and simply expected him to comply. He understood on some level that existed below his pride and his habit, and the accumulated weight of having been told his whole life that his last name was sufficient armor against most things, that the correct response was to go back to his table. That the geometry of this room, 12 men, the specific quality of their stillness, the way the one nearest the door had not looked at Chad once but had also not looked away from the general area of the door, communicated something clear and simple. That all the real estate, in all the county relationships, in all the carefully maintained entitlement in the world did not have an adequate answer to. He understood it. He stood there for another 3 seconds anyway, because the 3 seconds were all he had left. And then he went back to his table. He did not slam the chair. He did not make a scene. He sat down with the careful control of a man preserving whatever could still be preserved, and he stared at the table surface, and he did not say anything. And Mabel's diner breathed. Not audibly, but you could feel it, the incremental release of tension that a room undergoes when a confrontation that could have escalated simply does not. George picked up his newspaper and looked at it without reading it. The young mother exhaled quietly and put her arm around her son. Danny set the coffee pot down on the counter. Tommy Malone turned back to Ruth. "Where were we?" he said. "We were just starting," Ruth said. And that was all the acknowledgement made of what had just happened. The envelope was 9 inches by 12, standard manila. Ruth had opened it many times over the past year. She had opened it and reviewed its contents and closed it again and set it on the kitchen table on Birch Street and stood in her kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, looking at it, making sure she still believed what she believed about it. She still believed it. She set the envelope between herself and Tommy and began to remove the papers. They came out in the order she had arranged them, not chronological but strategic, the order that told the story most clearly to someone encountering it for the first time. She had thought about this. She had arranged and rearranged these papers many times, looking for the sequence that made the shape of it visible as quickly as possible. Tommy did not reach for them immediately. He let her lay them out. He watched her do it with the patience of a man who understood that the manner in which someone presents something tells you as much as the thing itself. She placed the first page, the letter, the original, sealed in a clear plastic sleeve, directly in front of him. He looked at it. 3 years ago, Ruth said. Her voice when she was telling this particular story had a quality that was neither flat nor emotional, but somewhere very specific in between. The quality of a woman who has told a painful thing enough times that she has learned to tell it without being pulled back into the moment of it, but who has also chosen not to drain it of its meaning in the telling. I received that letter on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just come back from here from this diner. I walked home and it was in the mailbox with the electric bill and a catalog I hadn't asked for. Tommy picked up the plastic sleeve, read, "The language is deliberate," Ruth said. They knew what they were doing with it. Potential legal exposure, unresolved boundary dispute, risk of prolonged litigation. They knew that the words themselves would do most of the work before a lawyer ever looked at the substance. "Did you show it to a lawyer?" "My lawyer had retired the previous spring. Moved to Phoenix. I called one other office in Cheyenne. They quoted me a consultation fee. I didn't call back." Tommy set the letter down and looked at Ruth rather than the papers. "You were alone," he said, not as an accusation, as a statement of fact that he was making sure they both acknowledged out loud. "I was alone," she said. "Yes." This was the part of the story that had required the most adjustment in the telling. Not the letter, not the contract, not the number on the check she had deposited and spent down over the following year on the ordinary costs of being 71 and alive in Wyoming. Those things she could describe with the clarity of record. The aloneness was harder. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because it was the true mechanism of what had been done to her, and the mechanism was designed to be invisible. You didn't need to forge anything. You didn't need to threaten anyone in terms a court would recognize. You needed a target who was elderly and isolated and already managing more than most people her age had to manage, and you needed the letter to arrive on a Tuesday when she had just come back from getting coffee, and the walk had made her hip hurt, and the house on Birch Street was quiet, in the way it had been quiet since Dale died, and you needed the language to be just frightening enough and just plausible enough that she would sign the paper and not understand until much later what she had agreed to. She had been 71 years old and the letter had worked exactly as intended. "You signed," Tommy said. "I signed." Ruth folded her hands on the counter. $47,000 for 3.5 acres. The land, Dale cleared himself. The land where we had the garden, where he had the workshop, where he spent. She paused, and the pause had weight. 31 years, $47,000. Tommy said nothing. "The assessed value at the time was $281,000, Ruth said. "My attorney confirmed that before she took the case." Tommy turned to the next page. He was not a fast reader in the way of someone skimming for key terms. He read the way he did most things completely, each line given its proper weight before moving to the next. Ruth waited. "The man who signed this," Tommy said eventually. "Krebs. He lost his license 2 years after he signed my contract," said a new voice. Sarah Park had come in quietly the way she did most things without announcement. She was 38 in a gray suit jacket and dark pants, carrying a laptop bag and a document case. She had a quality of focused energy that expressed itself not in volume or velocity, but in the way her eyes moved in a room, quick and systematic, locating the relevant information and filing it before the irrelevant noise had fully died away. She set her bags on the stool on Ruth's other side and opened the laptop case. "His disbarment came from a case in another state." Sarah continued, finding her place as naturally as if she had been in the middle of the sentence all along. The pattern there was nearly identical. Elderly property owners manufactured legal threats below market acquisitions. The disbarment came after a state investigation. But he wasn't disbarred when he signed Ruth's contract. He was still licensed. The disbarment came later, and the behavior that caused it was consistent with conduct going back at least 6 years. She looked at Tommy steadily, which means everything he signed during that period is potentially tainted, challengeable. And when you challenge it on the grounds of fraudulent inducement, the prior pattern becomes evidence of intent. Tommy looked at the contract page, at the signature. Then he looked at Ruth. "You knew this for a while," he said. Ruth looked at him. "Do you remember what Dale used to say about the young men who came to work in the shop, the ones who'd been in trouble?" Tommy waited. He said, "You give a man a fact, and he knows one thing. You give him time to understand why the fact matters, and he knows everything he needs to." She set her hands flat on the counter. "I needed time to understand why the fact mattered. I needed to understand the whole shape of it before I did anything. Because if I moved too early, I'd get one contract reviewed and nothing else would change. And now I understand the whole shape of it." She reached into the envelope and set a second document in front of Tommy. "I am not the only person in this county who received that letter," Ruth said. "Evelyn Warren, 76 years old, east end of town, sold her parcel 18 months before I sold mine. Her letter used almost identical language. Her contract was handled by Martin Krebs. Her sale price was 62% below market value." Ruth paused. I found Evelyn 8 months ago. She told me about Barbara Christine in the South County. Barbara found two others in the next hatchet over. Sarah found three more across the state. Tommy sat back on his stool. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, not in frustration, but in the way someone looks away from a chessboard when tracing the full shape of a game they've just understood. How long have you known all of this, he said. The shape of it, about a year. Sarah filed a preliminary complaint with the state prosecutor's office last Tuesday. You scheduled today. The town council votes on the development approval next week. The project documents have to be filed publicly before that vote. Once they're filed, the chain of title on every parcel in the development footprint becomes a matter of public record. If we were going to challenge the contracts, we needed to do it in the window between the public filing and the vote, when it would have the most weight. Ruth looked at her coffee, then back at Tommy. I called you last week to tell you we were getting close. I called you this morning because I woke up and decided I was done waiting for the right moment. I've been patient long enough. Dale would have told me I waited too long already. She paused. And I called you because I wanted you to know about the land, about what's in the file, about all of it. You had a right to know before this became public. Tommy was quiet. He looked at the door, then back at her. The tree, he said. Yes. You knew about the marker. I walk past that land every morning, Tommy. I have walked past it every morning since Dale died. I saw what you put there the week after you put it there. She looked at him. I never said anything because it didn't need to be said. But I knew. Something moved across Tommy Malone's face that he didn't try to control, which was itself a kind of measure of how far they were from anyone who needed to be performed for. For Dale, he said quietly. Who gave a damn? He did, Ruth said. He really did. They sat with that for a moment. The diner noise moved around them, the low sound of Danny refilling something near the pass-through, the murmur of two of Tommy's men in a corner booth, all of it peripheral, all of it unimportant. I didn't call you because I needed protecting, Ruth said. I want you to understand that. I'm not asking you to protect me. I know. I called you because when this comes out today, or this week, or whenever it fully lands, I wanted someone here who knew Dale, who knew what that land was. She folded her hands, not as muscle, as witness. Tommy looked at her for a long time without speaking. And what his face did in those seconds was not the face of a man calculating what he was being asked to provide. It was the face of a man who had been handed something he hadn't known he needed and was only now recognizing the shape of it. Okay, he said. That was all, just that. Frank DeLuca had been watching the counter for the better part of an hour with an expression that had been evolving in ways he wasn't entirely in control of. He recognized Sarah Park. He'd seen her name in the local paper a few months back, something about a property rights case in Fremont County, a small item buried near the back. He'd read it and moved on. But he had a policeman's memory for names that appear in particular kinds of contexts, and the name had stayed filed somewhere in his attention, waiting for a reason to surface. It was surfacing now. He looked at the envelope, at the papers, at the folder Sarah had brought. He thought about a filing cabinet in a building he hadn't worked in for 8 years, and a report in that filing cabinet that he had submitted on a Tuesday in November, and the following Monday when he had gone to check its status and found it had been logged as received and then reclassified to a hold status for reasons explained to him when he asked as jurisdictional complexity. He had asked twice more. The third time he was told the case had been referred to county level and was out of local jurisdiction. 3 months later, he had received the call about the early retirement package. He had told himself at the time and in the years since that the two things were separate, that the timing was coincidental, that he was tired anyway, that his pension was solid, that his daughter's tuition was not going to pay itself, that a man of 60 had earned the right to stop putting himself into situations that other people had decided were above his pay grade. He had believed some of these things more than others. He stood up. He walked to the counter, not to intervene, not to assert anything. He walked to the counter because there were only two directions a person could go at a moment like this, and he was no longer willing to choose the other one. Miss Ruth? He stood behind the empty stool on Tommy's far side. Mr. Malone? He nodded, looked at Sarah. Miss Park, I've seen your name. I've seen yours, Sarah said. She measured him with the attention of someone who had prepared for several versions of this conversation and was now determining which one she was in. Sit down, Mr. DeLuca. Frank sat. He looked at the papers. He found the signature near the top of the contract copy. He didn't need to look for long. Martin Krebs, he said. Tommy looked at him. I know that name, Frank said, not the recognition of someone reading a name in a document. The heavier recognition of someone who has been carrying a name for a long time in a place that was not comfortable. 3 years ago, when I was still with the department, a woman in the next county came in to file a complaint. Elderly. She'd received a letter about a boundary dispute she'd never heard of. She signed a contract she didn't fully understand. Her property sold for about a third of its value. He kept his eyes on the counter. The name on the documentation was Martin Krebs. I filed a report. I did the intake properly, got it logged, followed procedure. He paused. The report disappeared into hold status inside a week. I pushed on it twice. The third time I pushed, I was told it had been referred to county level and was out of local jurisdiction. He was quiet for a moment. 4 months later, I took an early retirement package. The terms were better than I expected. The counter was very quiet. Frank looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at him, and there was nothing in her expression of condemnation. There was something that was almost but more than patience. The look of a woman who had understood something for a longer time and was simply waiting for it to be named out loud. I knew what it meant, Frank said, what the package meant, why the timing was what it was. He set his hands flat on the counter. I told myself I had reasons. I did have reasons. None of them were good enough. Frank, Ruth said. He looked at her. I didn't bring you here to confess to me, she said. I need you to tell Sarah what you just told me. All of it. The date you filed, the name of the supervising officer, the exact language they used when they told you it was being held, the terms of the retirement offer, and who made it. Sarah already had her notebook open. Everything, she confirmed. None of it is too small. Frank DeLuca sat at the counter of Mabel's diner on a Thursday morning and began to tell the truth about something he had not told the truth about for 8 years, and the relief of it was not uncomplicated, but it was real. Ruth had been watching the mirror behind the counter. She saw the moment Chad reached into his pocket. It was a practiced gesture, the automatic reach of a man who has done something so many times it has lost the quality of a decision. He took out his phone, unlocked it with his thumb, navigated to the app, and set it on the table with the screen face down and the small indicator light showing through the gap between the phone's edge and the table surface. She recognized it because she had been looking for it. Not for this specific gesture exactly, but for some version of it. A man like Chad Merritt in a room that was no longer arranged in his favor would eventually reach for whatever angle he thought he had. The recording app was the angle he had reached for. He believed he was gathering ammunition. He believed that what was being said at this counter was something he could use later. Ruth looked at Sarah in the mirror. Sarah had seen it too. She gave no visible signal, no nod, no change of expression. But she closed the folder she had been working from and set her pen down in a way that meant she was done gathering and was now simply listening. Ruth understood. The file on Chad's phone contained everything Ruth had said in this room. Her statement, the names, the numbers, all of it recorded on Chad's own device because he had turned it on believing it would be useful to him. It was useful, just not in the direction he had intended. But Sarah was not asking for it yet, because Bill Merritt had just pulled into the parking lot. Ruth had seen the dark green F250 through the mirror, had watched it sit for almost 2 minutes before the door opened. She had known Bill would come. Chad had called him. Bill was the kind of man who came when a situation required managing, and Chad's voice on the phone had communicated clearly that managing was needed. What Bill did not know, what he could not know, because he had not been in this room for the past 2 hours, was that the situation was no longer manageable in any form he would recognize. Ruth folded her hands on the counter. She watched the door. She waited. Bill Merritt's truck was a late model F250 dark green, kept clean, in the way of a man who understood that the condition of what you owned communicated something about the kind of man you were. He had parked in the lot beside Mabel's, rather than along the curb, which was a small thing, but a telling one. He had not pulled up in front like someone arriving in a hurry. He had parked properly in a designated space, and he had taken a moment before getting out. He moved across the parking lot like a man who had decided in those 2 minutes in the truck on a specific approach. Not fast, not slow. The measured pace of someone who had walked into difficult rooms before and knew that the speed at which you entered communicated how seriously you took the room's ability to threaten you. He was wearing the flannel shirt and the khaki pants and the polished shoes, and his silver hair was brushed back with the neatness of a man who understood that appearance was a tool and used it accordingly. He came through the door. He looked at the room systematically, starting at the far corners and moving inward, reading the positions of the relevant parties before committing to any expression or direction. He looked at Tommy's men distributed through the diner. He looked at the counter. He looked at Frank sitting beside Sarah with a notebook open between them. He looked at the papers spread across the counter's surface. Then he looked at Ruth. His face when it landed on her did something careful and controlled. Not surprised he had known Ruth would be here, but something adjacent to surprise, the involuntary acknowledgement of a thing you knew abstractly and are now confronting in its full-dimensional reality. Ruth looked back at him. She did not look away. She did not adjust her posture or her expression. She simply looked at him with the same level of attention she had been giving to the room all morning. Bill moved toward the counter. He chose to approach Ruth directly, rather than the group at the far end, which told her something. He was going to try the personal angle first. The neighbor angle. The reasonable people resolving a misunderstanding angle. He sat down on the stool nearest her. He folded his hands on the counter. Ruth. The warmth in his voice was genuine in the way that the warmth of practiced men often is, not false exactly, but deployed, used. A tool like the clothes and the parking and the measured pace across the lot. I didn't know you were still in town. I thought you might have moved closer to family. I don't have family to move closer to Bill, Ruth said. You know that. Of course, he absorbed this without visible discomfort. I'm sorry, I misspoke. He looked at the papers on the counter without reaching for them. It looks like you've got quite a bit going on here this morning. I do, Ruth said. A pause. Bill looked at his hands, then back at Ruth with the expression of a man choosing to be generous in a situation where generosity was strategic. I think there may be some things that got handled poorly a few years ago, he said. In terms of the property transaction, sometimes when you're moving quickly on acquisitions, the process doesn't get the personal attention it deserves. Like, he said this as if it were a value he held independently, rather than a line he had decided on in the 2 minutes in the truck. If you felt the terms weren't what they should have been, I think we can talk about that. I think there's a conversation to be had here that doesn't need to involve a small gesture at the papers at Sarah and Frank at the far end, all of this. Ruth looked at him. She let the offer sit in the air between them for exactly as long as it needed to sit. What number were you thinking, Bill? Something in his posture relaxed slightly. This was terrain he knew. Numbers were solid ground. Numbers were manageable. When a conversation moved to numbers, it meant the other person was weighing something rather than refusing everything, and that was workable. I think we could look at something supplementary, he said, something that acknowledges the gap between what was paid and what a more careful process might have. Bill. He stopped. Ruth's voice had not changed in volume or temperature, but the word had the quality of a door being closed, not slammed simply shut. I didn't ask you what number you were thinking because I wanted to hear it, she said. I asked because I needed to hear whether you would say one. He looked at her. If you give me a number, Ruth said, you're telling me you already know the original price was wrong. You already know what you paid me was not what the land was worth. And you know it because you were told what it was worth before the letter was sent, before Martin Krebs put his name on the paper, before any of this happened. The counter was very quiet. Bill Merritt sat with his hands folded and his face doing the complex work of a man who has just understood that the ground he stepped onto was not the ground he thought he was stepping onto, and that the woman sitting across from him had known for some time exactly where the ground was and had said nothing until now. He looked at the papers. He looked at Sarah Park, who was watching him from the far end of the counter with an expression of focused and entirely impersonal attention. He looked at Ruth. That's a significant accusation, he said. Yes, Ruth said. It is. He shifted. I'd want to be careful about making claims that, Mr. Merritt, Sarah's voice arrived from the end of the counter, clear and even. I want to be transparent with you about where things stand. A preliminary complaint was filed with the state prosecutor's office in Cheyenne last Tuesday. The investigation is active. The documentation includes the original inducement letter, the contract communications records, and corroborating statements from parties in 3 additional counties. She did not rush any of it. I would encourage you to contact your legal counsel before this conversation continues further. Bill looked at her for a long moment. I think that's wise, he said. He unclenched his hands on the counter. But I think we can resolve this. I think there are ways to address whatever concerns have been raised without. He looked at the papers at Frank at Tommy, without this becoming something larger than it needs to be. He looked back at Ruth. I can make this right for you, Ruth, personally. Whatever number would make this, Bill, Ruth said. He stopped. You just said number again, Ruth said. I didn't mention a number. I didn't suggest a number. You introduced the idea of a number twice now. She held his gaze. That tells me you came in here already knowing what the land was worth when you paid me $47,000 for it. That tells me there is no misunderstanding to resolve because a misunderstanding would mean you didn't know you knew. The counter was absolutely still. Bill Merritt sat with his hands flat on the surface and his 30 years of carefully cultivated credibility rearranging itself around him in a way that would not finish rearranging for a long time. From the center table, Chad had not moved. He was watching his father with an expression that had traveled a very long distance from where it had started that morning. His phone was still on the table. The indicator light was still active. He had not moved to stop the recording. He had not moved to retrieve it. He sat with it in front of him and watched his father and did not do anything at all. Sarah looked at Chad. "I'll need that file now," she said. Chad looked at the phone. He looked at his father. He looked at Ruth, and in the look he gave her, there was something that was not quite an apology and not quite a question and was perhaps the beginning of both. He picked up the phone. He pulled up the file. He held it out to Sarah without speaking. Sarah took it. She checked the duration, 2 hours and 14 minutes. She saved it to her own device without expression. She set the phone back on the counter. "Thank you," she said to Chad. She meant it simply without irony, and he appeared to know it. Bill stood up. He smoothed the front of his flannel shirt with both hands. He looked at Ruth one final time, the longest look he had given her, a look without any of the management that had characterized everything else about his entrance and his approach, and then he walked to the door and pushed through it and crossed the parking lot to his truck. He sat in it again. This time everyone in the diner could see through the window that he was on the phone. The room breathed differently after Bill left. Not easier exactly. The situation had not resolved itself. There were no resolutions, yet those would come in offices and courtrooms over months that hadn't happened yet. But something had shifted in the fundamental orientation of the space. The morning had been a room in which one kind of order had been assumed, and another had been quietly assembled beneath it, and now the assumed order had walked out to a parking lot, and the assembled one remained. Tanner left without ceremony 7 minutes after Bill. He picked up his jacket, collected his phone, and walked out with the directional certainty of a man who has identified the nearest exit and has decided to use it. He did not say goodbye to Chad. He did not say anything to anyone. Kylie had gone earlier. Sometime between Ruth's statement and Bill's arrival, she had put her phone in her bag and found the side door near the kitchen, and when anyone looked at her table next, she was simply gone, which left Chad. He sat at the center table alone. He was not on his phone, not looking at the door, not watching the counter. He was looking at the table surface with the specific blanknesses of someone whose mind is working very hard at something that has no comfortable conclusion. Ruth watched him in the mirror for a while. Then she got up from her stool. She moved slowly, the hip worse now, with the cold coming through the door, and she had been sitting a long time. She took her cane. She crossed the floor. She stopped at Chad's table. She did not sit down. She stood across from him and waited. He looked up after a moment. His face, without the performance of the morning, was younger than it had seemed earlier. Not in a way that was flattering. More in the way a person looks younger when the thing propping them up is no longer there and what's left is just the person without the propping. "I didn't know all of it," he said. His voice was not the voice from this morning, not the carrying voice built for center tables and audiences. It was a voice that had been reduced to its actual size. "I know you didn't," Ruth said. This appeared to surprise him. "I knew Dad was buying up land. I knew some of the acquisitions were," he paused, looking for the word that was honest without being the full truth, and then apparently deciding that the full truth was the only version we're saying here. "Below market. I didn't ask why. I did due diligence on the numbers and not on anything else because the numbers were my job and the rest of it was not your department," Ruth said. He looked at her. "That's what you were going to say," she said. "Not your department, not your responsibility. Your job was the numbers." He looked at the table. "Yeah, that's not a defense," Ruth said. "I'm not saying it is. I'm telling you that I know the difference between a man who builds something like what your father built and a young man who inherits the benefits of it and learns not to look at the foundation." She looked at him steadily. "You benefited. You knew enough to know something wasn't right and you chose not to know more. That's not innocence, but it's also not the same thing as what's in those papers." Chad was quiet. "I'm not asking you for anything," Ruth said. "I'm not asking you to testify or confess or make anything easier for the case. Sarah has what she needs. What happens from here doesn't depend on you." She shifted her weight slightly. I came over here because Dale used to say the only waste worse than ruined land is a person who could have been better than they were and never found out. He said it about the young men who came to work in his shop. Some of them surprised him, some of them didn't. Chad looked at her. There was something in his face working very hard not to become something visible. "What do you do with that?" he said. Not quite a question and not quite a statement. The sound of a man arriving at a junction he didn't have a map for. "I think you already know," Ruth said. "I think you've known something was wrong for a while and you kept moving because stopping meant looking at it. So you stop and you look at it." She paused. "What you do after that is your business, not mine. I've got enough of my own to manage." She turned and walked back to the counter. The room found a new rhythm after that. It was not the rhythm of a normal Thursday morning. That was gone probably permanently in the way the room is changed by the things that have happened in it even after the people involved have cleared out. But it was a rhythm. The couple near the window finished their eggs. Danny moved through her tables with the efficiency of someone who had processed an enormous amount of unusual information and was coping with it by doing the tasks she knew how to do. Two of Tommy's men in the corner booth were on their second coffees. At the counter, Sarah was working through something with Frank, who had pulled his chair around to her side and was providing dates and names in the careful voice of a man who has decided to be thorough. Tommy sat beside Ruth. They were not talking. They had not needed to talk for a while. After a time, George Harmon came over. He stopped behind Ruth's stool. "Miss Ruth," he said. She turned. "I know about Warren's land," he said. "Evelyn's husband told me about the letter when he got it. He was embarrassed about the whole thing, didn't want it to get around, but he needed to tell someone." George looked at his own hands for a moment. "I told him it sounded like it might come to nothing, that these things sometimes do." He looked at Ruth. "I should have said more than that. George, I want to say it in front of whoever needs to hear it. I'll make a statement, or whatever you call it. Whatever would be useful." He looked at Sarah. "I have a clear memory of what he told me. Dates, some of the language from the letter. He described it in detail because he was scared and talking made him feel better." He straightened. "I remember most of it." Sarah reached for her notebook. "Please sit down, Mr. Harmon." George sat. Harriet Voss came over 5 minutes later, less tentative than George, because she was constitutionally less tentative than most people she knew. She had worked at the post office for 17 years and had spent 17 years quietly observing the movement of official correspondence through Pine Ridge in a way that gave her a particular perspective on the town's business and legal affairs. "I photocopied that letter," she said to Ruth without preamble. "The one from 3 years ago. You needed it for your records and your printer was broken, so you came in and I ran a copy for you on the machine and back." She looked at Sarah. "I still have my copy logs from that period. The date of the copy, the document description I noted for the log, physical documentation of when the letter existed and what it contained." She paused. "I don't know if that's useful." "It's useful," Sarah said. Harriet sat down. Jim Castellano, one of the plumbers who had come in for breakfast, came over last. He didn't sit. He stopped behind George's chair and looked at Ruth and said, "I've done work on 3 properties in that East Valley development area. The drainage on at least 2 of them is not what the county was told it was. There are reports filed that don't match what I saw when I was out there." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a business card which he set on the counter. "I don't know if that's for you or for someone else, but I've been thinking about it for a while." He left the card and went back to his table. Ruth looked at the card. She set it beside Sarah's elbow without speaking. Sarah picked it up. She added it to the growing pile of things the morning had produced. Across the room, she caught Ruth's eye and held it for just a moment. No words. None were needed. Person by person, the room was deciding what it actually believed. Wade Holloway arrived at 11:43. He came alone, which told you something. A county sheriff responding to a call involving a property fraud investigation and a room containing 12 Hells Angels would typically bring at least a deputy. Holloway had come alone because Frank had called him before calling. The department had told him specifically what was in the room and what was on the counter, and Holloway had made the decision that this was a matter he needed to walk into with the full weight of his own judgment rather than with the procedural armor of institutional backup. He was 57, heavyset in the way of men who were once very fit and have made their peace with the years, with a face that carried the particular honesty of someone who had not found the job easy and had stopped pretending otherwise. He and Bill Merritt had known each other for 2 decades. This was not a secret. It was part of Pine Ridge's social geometry, known and factored in by everyone who lived here. He came through the door without the room-reading hesitation that Bill had performed. He had been told what was in the room. He looked at Tommy's group with the quick professional assessment of a man confirming a situation as what he was told. It was, then moved directly to the counter. He looked at Ruth first. Miss Ruth. Wade. He looked at Sarah, at the papers, at Frank. Frank, he said. Wade. Frank's voice had a quality in it that was different from the voice he'd used earlier that morning. This was the voice of a man talking to someone he had worked alongside for 15 years and was now talking to in a different capacity. I need to walk you through some things. I know you do. Holloway sat down. He looked at the papers Sarah slid toward him. He read the way Frank had read them, with the careful directness of someone intending to understand exactly what they were seeing. He read for several minutes. Frank provided context where it was needed. Sarah answered 3 specific questions about the prosecutorial filing in Cheyenne. Holloway asked without editorializing and received the answers the same way. Then he looked at the file designation on Sarah's laptop. That audio, he said, from this morning. Yes, Sarah said. He looked at her for a moment. I'll need a copy of that. You'll have it before I leave today. Holloway sat back. He looked at the window. He looked at Frank. He looked at Ruth. I know what I should have done 3 years ago, he said, not looking away. And I know what I'm going to do from here. Those are different things, and I don't expect you to treat them as the same. He looked at Sarah. I want to coordinate with the prosecutor's office directly. Today. I can make that introduction, Sarah said. Good. He stood. He looked at the room one more time at Tommy's men, at the couple near the window who had given up pretending not to listen, at George and Harriet, and Jim Castellano's card beside Sarah's elbow. He went back through the door. Tommy had his jacket on by noon. His men were already filtering out in the unhurried way they had arrived, collecting themselves from their corners and their booths and making their way through the door in small groups. The sound of engines starting came through the glass in a sequence, one at a time, building back toward the volume that had stopped the room that morning. The room did not stop for it this time. It registered, it acknowledged it, but the shock was gone. It had become part of the morning's texture. Tommy stood behind his stool at the counter. Ruth turned to look at him. You have everything you need, he said. Sarah has everything she needs. Ruth said, that's the same thing. He nodded. He looked at the door, then back at her. The spring meeting. We come through here in May. I want to stop. You always stop, Ruth said. I want to stop for longer this time. He looked at the door, then back. The east corner of the land, the section they have been planning to grade first. That's where the oak is. I know where the oak is, Tommy. The marker's still there. I walked past it 6 days ago, Ruth said. It's still there. When the land comes back. When the land comes back, Ruth said, you come in May and you bring whatever you need for the garden, and we spend a day outside, and I'll make the same potato salad that Dale always wanted me to write down the recipe for, and never did. She looked at him. I remember most of it. Tommy looked at her for a long moment. On his face again was that uncomplicated warmth, the warmth of a man in the presence of someone who represented a period of his life he had not been able to protect at the time, and could not go back to, but that he had long since accepted, would be honored best not by grief but by presence. He reached out and set his hand briefly on her shoulder, the gesture of a large man being careful with something he valued. Dale was a smart man, Tommy said. He was, Ruth agreed. He picked good at people. Ruth looked at the counter, at her empty coffee mug, at the place where the envelope had been now empty, its contents in Sarah's document case. He did, she said. Tommy walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped and said something to Danny. Ruth couldn't hear the words from the counter, but she saw Danny look up surprised and then nod. Tommy went through the door. 30 seconds later, the last of the engines turned over and the sound built and moved and receded down Main Street, fading the way it had arrived all at once, and then less and then gone. The diner was quieter than it had been in hours. It was almost 2 o'clock when Ruth finally left. Sarah packed her case methodically, confirming with Ruth each item as it went in. She would call tomorrow with an update on the prosecutor's office. She would call after the council vote, which was now given the active investigation likely to be postponed. She would call whenever there was something Ruth needed to know, and Ruth should call whenever she had questions or when something felt wrong, regardless of the hour. Ruth said she would. She thanked Sarah in the way she thanked people she genuinely meant to thank, briefly, without decoration, looking directly at her. Sarah gathered her things and went. Frank left shortly after. He stopped beside Ruth's stool on his way out and stood there for a moment without speaking, and Ruth let him stand there because she understood he needed a moment in which something was acknowledged between them without the mechanism of words. I'll do it right this time, he said. I know you will, Ruth said. He went. George and Harriet had long since returned to their establishments. Jim Castellano's truck was gone from the lot. The couple near the window had finally left the woman stopping to briefly squeeze Ruth's arm as she passed a gesture that was warm and slightly awkward and entirely genuine. Danny was wiping down the far end of the counter. She worked her way up to where Ruth sat, and when she got there, she stopped. He left something, Danny said. She reached under the counter and produced a folded piece of paper. The big one, the one you called. He gave it to me on his way out. She set it on the counter. He said to give it to you after everyone left. Ruth's name was written on the front in handwriting that was large and deliberate and slightly unpracticed. The handwriting of a man who did not write many notes. She opened it. Inside, in the same large, deliberate hand, was a single line. For the east corner, plant them deep this year. The ground there holds water if you let it. And below that, a specific variety of sunflower seed. Not the common variety, but the tall heritage variety that Dale had ordered from a catalog 20 years ago and grown every summer until the summer he couldn't anymore. The name written out carefully as if he had looked it up to make sure he had it right. Ruth held the paper for a long time. She thought about the oak tree, about the marker beneath it, about the 31 years Dale had put into that land, and the 3 years it had been gone from her, and the many months she had spent making sure she understood every mechanism by which it had been taken before she did a single thing about getting it back. She thought about the October light coming through the window of Mabel's own diner onto her hands, which were the hands of a woman who had been alive for 74 years and intended to be alive for more of them. She folded the paper and put it in her bag in the pocket where the envelope had been. She got up slowly. She put on her brown coat. She collected her bag. She looked at the counter, at her mug, at the stool where Tommy had sat at the long surface of the bar that had held the papers for the better part of a morning and was now simply a counter, again empty and wiped clean. Danny, she said. Danny looked up from the far end. What do I owe you? Danny looked at her for a moment, then she shook her head. Today's on the house, Miss Ruth. Ruth considered objecting to this. She decided not to. Thank you, sweetheart, she said. She went to the door. She stood on the sidewalk outside Mabel's for a moment before she began walking. The October light was doing what October light does in Wyoming, coming in low and long, hitting surfaces at angles that summer never produced, making ordinary things the side of George's hardware store. The flag above the post office, the chrome trim of a parked truck, looked briefly like something more than what they were, like they had been illuminated specifically to be seen. Ruth looked down Main Street, then up it. 31 years of her life and Dale's were in the land at the end of Oak Road. 3 years of that land had been in the possession of someone else. Many months of careful, patient, unglamorous work had been building toward a morning that from the outside would have looked like nothing more than an old woman sitting at a diner counter. That was fine with her. She had never needed it to look like anything from the outside. She thought about Tommy somewhere on a Wyoming highway, now the October cold coming through the vents, the particular freedom of a man moving through the landscape he calls home. She thought about the east corner of the Callaway land, where the oak stood and the marker sat beneath it, patient as the tree itself. For Dale, who gave a damn? Dale had given a damn. About the land, about the work, about the young men who came to the shop without much to recommend them, and left with a trade and something harder to name. He had given a damn about doing things right, about the foundation, holding about what you left behind, being worth what you put into it. She looked at the October sky over Pine Ridge. High and cold and entirely clear, the kind of sky that made no promises and kept all of them. She turned toward Birch Street and began to walk. The weeks that followed moved the way legal matters move, not in the clean lines of resolution, but in the slow accumulation of consequence. 6 weeks after that Thursday morning, the state prosecutor's office in Cheyenne formalized the investigation into Merit Real Estate Group and its acquisition practices across 4 counties. Sarah made the call to Ruth on a Tuesday evening, and Ruth listened with her tea cooling in front of her and wrote the relevant dates in her notebook and thanked Sarah and hung up and sat for a while with her hands around the mug. The town council's vote on the development project was withdrawn before it could be scheduled. The filing that should have accompanied it, the chain of title on every parcel in the development footprint, was under review, and there was no vote to be had until the review was resolved. Pine Ridge did not officially discuss this, but Pine Ridge knew the way. Pine Ridge always knew things, and the knowing moved through the town in the quiet way of information that everyone has absorbed and no one needs to state out loud. Bill Merritt retained counsel in Cheyenne. Ruth heard this from Frank, who heard it from Wade Holloway, who had made 3 separate visits to the prosecutor's office in the month following the morning at Mabel's. Holloway had gone each time without being asked. He had brought what he had and answered every question he was asked about what he knew and when he knew it and what he had chosen to do about it at the time. He called Frank after the 3rd visit and said, "We're past the point of damage control. We're at the point of actual consequence." Frank had told Ruth those exact words because he thought she deserved to hear them in those terms. 3 months after the Thursday at Mabel's, the Fremont County Court issued its ruling on the Callaway contract. Fraudulent inducement. Void from the beginning as if it had never existed. The land was Ruth's. The court also awarded damages $189,000 calculated from the difference between the actual market value and the price paid plus documented losses from the period of dispossession. Ruth read the ruling at her kitchen table on a Wednesday morning. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked out the window at the back garden for a long time without moving. Evelyn Warren's case followed 2 months later. Barbara Christine's was still in progress but moving in the right direction. Sarah sent updates with the regularity she had promised, brief and factual, and Ruth read each one and filed it in the envelope that now held different papers than it had before. Chad Merritt left Pine Ridge 40 days after the morning at Mabel's. His car was gone one weekday morning and not back the following morning and not back after that. No announcement, no farewell. Ruth heard this from George, who had seen the house dark for several days running, before concluding it was not a temporary absence. She thought about Chad for a moment when George told her about the expression on his face when he handed Sarah his phone, about the last thing she had said to him, and she hoped without expectation that something had begun for him that morning, rather than simply ending. The eastern corner of the Callaway land, where the oak stood and the marker sat beneath it, was untouched. The project equipment that had been staged nearby was removed once the investigation became public. The land sat as it had sat for years, quiet and unharvested, waiting for the season to turn. Ruth's house on Birch Street had a new roof by November. The soft spot on the porch step was fixed in October, the week after the ruling came through, by a man she called from the hardware store who did the repair in an afternoon and charged her fairly and did not ask questions about why she had waited so long to have it done. She did not tell him. Some things were hers to keep. It was a Thursday in late October when Ruth walked into Mabel's diner at 8:15 in the morning and went directly to the corner table by the east window. Her corner table. The one with the scuff marks on the floor where she always pulled out the chair. She sat down, she settled her bag, she placed her cane against the wall. Danny appeared without being called and set down the coffee and the toast with apple jam before Ruth had spoken a word. "Morning, Miss Ruth." "Morning, sweetheart." Ruth wrapped both hands around the mug. She drank. Outside, Pine Ridge was going about its Thursday. George opened the hardware store across the street with the same key he had used for 20 years, the lock turning with the ease of long familiarity. The flag above the post office moved in a wind that had come down from the north with the particular intention of the early Wyoming cold, which did not threaten so much as simply state the facts of the coming season. George looked through the window and saw Ruth at her corner table and knocked lightly on the glass with one knuckle. Ruth raised her hand. A moment later, Harriet walked past and did the same thing, a quick tap on the glass, a small wave, and kept walking toward the post office. No ceremony, no production, just the small gestures of people who see each other and mean it. Ruth opened her black notebook. She uncapped her pen. She looked at the blank page for a moment. Then she began to write. She wrote for a while with the particular focus of someone who is setting something down because it deserves to be set down, because the record matters, because aching things and good things both deserve the same careful, honest accounting. She wrote until the coffee was gone and the toast was gone, and the October light had moved across the table from one angle to another, marking the passage of the morning. Then she set down her pen. She looked out the window at the street, at the town going about its Thursday, at the sky over Wyoming. That was the specific blue of late autumn, cold and high and clean. She thought about Dale, not in the way grief announces itself, but in the quiet way of someone who has been missed so long that the missing has become a kind of presence. She thought about the workshop and the garden and the 30 years of ordinary days that had been, she understood better now than she had at the time, extraordinary in their dailiness. She thought about what he would have said about these past months. He would have said she took too long. He also would have made the potato salad. She could not make it for one person. The recipe existed only in the movement of her hands doing it, and her hands did not know how to do it for one. But next May, when Tommy came and they spent a day on the land with the sunflowers going in the east corner, She would make it for however many people were there, and that was enough. That was the right occasion for it. She thought about all of them. Frank, who had chosen the harder direction at the last possible moment and was living, she suspected, more honestly for it. Holloway, who had gone back 3 times to the prosecutor's office without being asked. George and Harriet and Jim Castellano's business card. Danny, who had placed her hand on Ruth's arm in the middle of a difficult morning and not said a word. The young mother by the window who had pulled her son a little closer. She thought about Chad Merritt, somewhere she didn't know in a life she couldn't see, standing at the junction she had tried to show him without telling him which direction to take. She thought about 12 motorcycles on a Wyoming highway moving through the landscape with the particular freedom of people who have done what they came to do and can now go where the road goes. She thought about a small wooden marker under an oak tree on the land at the end of Oak Road, waiting for spring, with the patience of everything that has been placed in the ground and trusted to the season. For Dale. Who gave a damn? Ruth Calloway picked up her coffee mug and found it empty and set it down and sat for a moment with her hands open on the table, palms up, the way you sit when you are not holding anything, and you are all right with that. Then she reached into her bag and took out the folded piece of paper Tommy had left with Danny and opened it again and read the sunflower variety written out in his large, careful hand, and thought about the east corner of the land and the specific quality of the soil there and how deep was deep enough, and whether she still had the old planting stakes in the shed behind the house. She thought she did. She put the paper back in her bag. She put on her coat. She left the money on the table, slightly more than the bill, the same amount she always left. She took her cane. She walked out into the October morning in Pine Ridge, Wyoming, into the low, long light and the cold that was coming and the flag moving above the post office and the ordinary sounds of a small town going about its Thursday, and she turned toward Birch Street and she walked home. There is a kind of person the world looks at and sees nothing particular. They move slowly. They dress practically. They count their money carefully. They don't take up more space than they need. They don't announce themselves. They sit in the same corner of the same diner for 17 years, and the chair knows the shape of them better than most people do. And if you are the kind of person who mistakes quiet for empty, patience for weakness, stillness for surrender, then you look at someone like that and you see an easy mark. You see someone who won't push back. What you don't see, because you have never had reason to learn to look for it, is the notebook, the careful dates, the 17 years of being present in a place and paying attention and remembering everything. The phone call made at 6 in the morning to the one person in the world who would drive fast when she called. The envelope carried for 6 weeks waiting for the right morning, the attorney in Cheyenne. The 14 months of building something the way Dale had taught her to build things, from the foundation up, each piece earning its place before the next one was set on top of it. You don't see any of that. And so you sit down at the center table and you laugh and you think you have understood the room. But the room was arranged long before you walked in. That Thursday morning in Pine Ridge, 12 Hells Angels came through the door of Mabel's diner and silenced everyone in it with the simple, unmistakable authority of their presence. But the person who had actually silenced the room was already there. She had been there for an hour. She had been waiting. And when the time came, she did not raise her voice, and she did not need to, and she did not look away. 74 years old, brown cocaine coffee, she let go cold because she was busy watching the door. Ruth Calloway, who knew exactly who she was and was content to let everyone else find out in their own time.